Nowhere is the superhuman nature of the body more starkly revealed than in trauma medicine, the treatment of injury.
I don't remember anything that night.
I realized my left arm had almost fallen off and it was hanging there by the skin.
They had to stop the bleeding because I was bleeding internally. They had to remove my spleen because it had ruptured at the accident.
Somebody asked, would I make it? But it was no way.
Trauma is the biggest killer of people under 40. And the biggest killer of all is the car. It's hard to imagine the massive deceleration forces of a car crash. So how about this? With collisions as violent as that, it's amazing that any of us survive car crashes at all. If I'd been inside the car, I would have experienced extreme G-forces. In the fractions of a second during impact, my body weight would have multiplied 60 times. My 75-kilo frame would have become nearly 5,000 kilos. And these same huge deceleration forces are what the driver of this car experienced when he crashed headlong into a bus. Each year in the UK, 325,000 people are injured in car accidents. That's an average of 1 in every 90 seconds. Michael Sharp had been driving home from seeing his sister when his car collided with a bus.
I don't remember anything that night.
I don't know how he walked out of that car. I don't know. But I'm glad he did.
He says he's got no back pain. No back pain. Yeah.
When Michael was removed from his wrecked car, he was in a bad way.
Oh.
He soon began to show classic symptoms of traumatic shock. He's confused and aggressive.
Stay back. No, don't do it, stay black, stay.
His pupils dilate and he starts to sweat. His blood pressure rises and his heart beats faster. Soon his veins start to constrict and redirect the flow of blood away from his skin to his vital organs. His breathing becomes fast and short as his lungs work to capture as much oxygen as possible. Armies of white blood cells are mobilized to the site of injury. This is the body's standard way of coping with its injuries. The trauma team are also going through their standard response. They're following 3 life-saving principles known as the ABCs. Firstly, A, they check Michael's airways, making sure they're clear, without which B for breathing wouldn't be possible. And if you can't breathe, you can't get life-sustaining oxygen into the body. And without that, there would be no oxygen for the circulation, C, to carry around the body. The brain in particular is very sensitive to even a short while without oxygen. Within as little as 3 minutes, you could suffer permanent brain damage. When they got Michael into hospital, he started to fit. It's distressing, but quite common after a severe blow to the head. Fitting has to be stopped very quickly, because if it continues, his breathing will become uncontrolled, and the risk again is cutting off the oxygen to the brain. Fortunately, they soon managed to calm him down.
He says he's got no pain in his chest or neck.
Okay.
I don't know if I'm supposed to feel lucky or anything. I just, you know, because it happened so quickly and I don't remember anything about it, it doesn't feel like anything really happened.
3 months later, and Michael is back to normal.
I look at life totally different now.
Show me your left foot.
Things that I used to take for granted before, I mean, I actually concentrate on them now. No, I mean, I always loved Corin. Corin's my big boy. But I am more focused on Corin now.
Left foot. See that left foot?
I'm lucky to be here.
The treatment of trauma is like a delicate and sometimes cruel game of chess. Treating a seriously injured patient is not just a race against the clock.
Back of the head. Right, nice. There's blood there. I can't see an obvious laceration.
Call anesthesia. He's got a big hematoma. It's hard to feel if there's a bony thing under there or not.
Every doctor faced with a trauma victim has to make precise decisions, and each one of them can have consequences.
It is, of course, but this one's nice.
No,
that was a second. That was a second. This is the first. Could be retroperitoneal. That's the only other thing with it.
Yeah, let's get anesthesia. This is awfully weird breathing.
So doctors have to be ready to vary their game plan.
Jose? Yeah. Hold on anesthesia for a second. Get a staple remover, roll him back. Get a staple remover. It's like an arterial bleed. I don't know what that is. Roll him back.
And trauma medicine is going through some quite revolutionary changes. Changes driven by our increased understanding of the ways the human body tries to preserve itself after injury. And the thing the body tries to preserve above almost everything else is blood. Blood is something that most people are extremely squeamish about. As a surgeon, I've seen lots of other people's, but I don't much like seeing my own. However, here goes. One drop of my blood contains about 5 million red blood cells. Red blood cells make up just under half the total volume of blood, and their main function is to carry oxygen from the lungs to the rest of the body. We produce 200 billion new red cells every day, and in 24 hours, the blood in our bodies travels a total of 19,000 kilometers. That's 4 times across the USA. We tend to take this precious liquid for granted. Our bodies cope pretty well with large losses of blood, but we don't have an unlimited supply. I've had a pint drained off me and I feel okay. There are potentially another 8 bags left inside, and I'll replace what I've lost within the next 2 weeks. What's so surprising is that after an accident, you can lose a huge amount of your blood without there being any external bleeding. If I fractured my thigh, for example, I could lose 1/3 of my blood supply into my leg. These sorts of internal injuries can lead to a massive fall in blood pressure, and the standard medical response has always been to try and correct it by replacing the blood fluid as fast as possible. But standard medical responses can be wrong, and nowhere has this lesson been better learnt than in war.
Okay. 100 meters away from it now, just from here. Okay, try to bring him back here. Remember to stop the bleeding.
Injuries in the Vietnam War were horrendous, but what was unique was the speed at which medical help arrived. Helicopters were able to reach the injured within minutes. At that time, the standard treatment was to replace lost blood and to raise the blood pressure as quickly as possible. Blood or other fluids were poured in before soldiers even got off the ground. Many of the injured went on to die. Doctors have begun to wonder if sometimes this treatment did more harm than good.
I am sure that a number of these people this century have actually probably been killed by their treatment. Someone's come up, particularly in wars like Vietnam, where they had medical support in close, put lines up, raised their blood pressure, didn't stop the tap, and I'm sure they've made them re-bleed.
The way the body responds to bleeding is by forming a clot. Platelets in the blood rush to the injury site and are cemented together by fibrin. Initially, the clot is quite delicate and easily blown apart by a change in blood pressure. A blood clot is a dam. It plugs the flow of blood. If the blood pressure is low, there's less for the clot to hold back. But increase the pressure and the dam could burst, and that could be disastrous. And that's exactly what happened to many of the soldiers in Vietnam.
Suddenly, they're pulled into a helicopter, lines are put in, blood pressure's driven up, they bleed. I think Mother Nature's built in a mechanism to take care of us. It's centuries old and not millennia old. We've got to be damn careful that any treatment we devise does not upset that.
Jim Ryan was a surgeon in the Falklands, where medical circumstances were very different. Unlike Vietnam, night battles and bad weather meant quick helicopter recovery was impossible. Injured soldiers were often left alone for hours, and Mother Nature was given a chance to work. In 1982, David Gray was in the 2nd Battalion of the Parachute Regiment. He was just 18 years old when he suffered appalling injuries in a mortar attack at Goose Green.
We broke the brow of the hill, so of course you had your rear echelon at the back, your frontline blokes going into Goose Green, and then everybody that was injured on that slope going down were exposed and under sniper fire as well. I went back for Tony Ty, who'd been shot. He had a gunshot wound in his right arm, and then I got hit by a mortar round. Thud. I can't describe what it was like. I thought that was very close. I rolled over, and when I looked down, I realised that my right foot had gone. I was probably laying there for 3 to 4 hours before I actually was administered with any fluids, and I was losing blood all the time I was doing it. When somebody asked would I make it was no way.
Soldiers with injuries as bad as David's were not expected to survive, yet many of them did.
We were shocked, pleased and shocked to see people still alive, having waited 6, 8, 10 hours with traumatic amputations, multiple injuries. Many of them should have died, but some of them didn't.
Jim Ryan believes that the long wait before fluids were administered may actually have saved these men's lives.
They probably fell down, lay very quiet. They will have bled out significantly, but not to the point of death. They clot, they form a good clot. No one gives them fluids to raise their blood pressure, and they just hang in there.
As a result of observations like this, the routine giving of fluids to all trauma victims is being questioned. Paramedics now watch and wait before trying to raise blood pressure. But there was another vital factor at work in the Falklands: the cold.
The cold I can remember probably more than anything. Numbness, fingers, face.
Profoundly cold. You know, we didn't have really low-reading thermometers, but these were off the values of the thermometers that we had, certainly below 30, almost looking like corpses.
But rather than doing any serious harm, Jim Ryan feels the cold may actually have helped survival.
I think in this situation, and many people would agree with me, hypothermia, a mild degree of hypothermia, is positively protective. Yeah, I think it just slows the whole thing down.
What war has revealed about the human body is that sometimes cold can be a lifesaver, and this knowledge is now being used to save accident victims. On a freezing November day, Kate Close was thrown from her horse. Paramedics didn't reach her for nearly 2 hours, by which time she was extremely cold. The main concern was her massive head injury, and she was rushed to the Royal London Hospital.
So that's about it, really. Just like I say, the Kate GCS 12, 2 hours old.
Her doctor, Alistair Wilson, was also extremely worried about her head injury. He ordered an urgent CT scan, and the results were horrific.
Oh, crikey, Ryan. Bloomin' heck. Look at all that hair as well. In view of the fairly gross nature of her injuries, I felt that probably her survival chances were in the region of perhaps 5%. So I wasn't being very hopeful at that stage.
Alistair Wilson then made an extraordinary decision. He decided not to warm her up.
The temperature was very low. It was just, initially, I think, just under 34 degrees. And then we felt, well, this is probably a good thing on the one hand, because it's going to reduce the oxygen requirements of the brain, which means that it's less likely to become hypoxic, to get into a state where it's doing damage to itself.
When Kate fell off her horse and injured her brain, it set off a dangerous chain reaction. Any injury to brain cells can trigger the release of destructive chemicals. If they're not stopped, these chemicals cause other, uninjured brain cells to die. Although we don't know precisely why, we do know that cooling the brain by just a few degrees can stop further widespread damage happening. Still cold, Kate was rushed to surgery, where the blood clot that had formed on her brain was removed. Amazingly, she suffered no brain damage.
I've always hated the cold. But now I've been told that as a result of hypothermia, that's one of the things that helped to save me. I still don't like feeling cold. I must admit, I don't like the cold, but on this occasion, my goodness me, it did me a lot of favour. It really, really did.
And cold is now being used in other, less obvious areas of trauma medicine. Trauma isn't just war and car crashes. It can be part of our first moments in this world, being born. For many of us, being born is the most dangerous event we'll ever experience. The journey down the birth canal may be short, but it can be very hazardous. During his delivery, Ross Walker was starved of oxygen. The chance of surviving without severe brain damage was extremely low.
The first thing that struck me was the fact that he was quiet and there was no particular movement from him.
The heart rate should have been around about 140, 145 beats per minute, and he'd gone down to about 80 beats per minute.
Once he had fitted for the second time, they realised that there was something worse than what they first thought. They were told us that it was 94% chance that he could have severe brain damage.
Lack of oxygen had begun the chemical chain reaction in his brain, and now some of his brain cells were starting to die off. Ross was rushed to the Hammersmith Hospital in London, where they were trying a radically different treatment. To prevent brain damage, babies like Ross were cooled down.
He was in it's like a paddling pool without the bottom or the top, and he was in the centre and the cold air was blowing across him. So that was cooling him down by 2 degrees below the body temperature. And he was cold to touch and dry as well, and yeah, it seemed an odd thing to do. And your natural reaction is to cuddle them and keep them warm.
Wrap him up.
That's right, wrap him up. So once they'd explained why, or the reasons why they thought that's when it would help, then obviously we knew it was probably for the best, and you know, had to cope with those sort of feelings until we could give him a proper cuddle later on. I felt helpless because I couldn't do anything. I couldn't hold him. I couldn't do anything to help him.
When he first arrived at the Hammersmith, Ross's brainwave output was virtually zero. As he became cooler and cooler, his parents simply had to wait to see what might happen.
We just sat by the bedside, didn't we, just watching and willing this machine to show us some brain waves that were showing signs of activity.
Over the following 2 years, successive brain scans revealed that Ross was developing into a normal, healthy toddler.
He's a very happy boy. He's very lively. He's jumping around. He enjoys playing. It's good fun. I don't know what kind of boy Ross would have been without this treatment.
He is right where he should be for a normal 2-year-old. The best bit, isn't it? We could say that he may have got better on his own, of his own accord, but at the end of the day, I feel in our heart of hearts that we can say that without the treatment that he would have been severely brain damaged.
Although it does seem rather odd, being cold can actually be good for you. Doctors are now trying it in a variety of circumstances, from head injuries to heart attacks. But getting somebody to lower their body temperature can be really quite difficult. That's because our bodies are designed to maintain a stable temperature. Let me show you what I mean. I'm getting down to my underwear in this building made entirely of ice. The temperature in here is below freezing, and believe me, it's jolly cold. So how long will it take for my body temperature to drop? It's now half an hour later, and although I feel very cold, my body temperature's only dropped by 1 degree. So you can see that our bodies are normally very good at keeping us warm. Can I get my clothes on now? But when we're badly wounded, those normal controls break down. In fact, cooling is the end point of the process we call shock. And the often strange ways people behave when they're in shock can be traced back to our evolutionary origins. As far as our bodies are concerned, we're still just animals fighting for survival, struggling to escape and find a safe place to hide. It's called fight or flight. The body is flooded with adrenaline. Adrenaline makes the heart beat faster. The lungs work harder. The body is shouting, "Escape, escape." It's why victims often struggle with people trying to save them.
You can't, Kate, don't fight now. Don't fight now. No, this is up.
At the same time, the brain releases a surge of pain-killing hormones, endorphins. These are so powerful that you can have a limb blown off and feel nothing.
I'd literally gone numb from the waist downwards. You'd just gone through your pain barrier.
After a while, however, the effects of these hormones start to wear off. The heart slows down, blood pressure drops. Clots form. Blood drains away from all but the most essential organs. The body cools and starts the long process of self-repair. The idea of trying to work in harmony with the body is hardly a new one. This is the Greek island of Kos. It was once home to the ancient world's most famous doctor, Hippocrates. Hippocrates taught his followers that it was vital to observe and listen to what the body was trying to say. It may not look much, but this is where modern medicine really began. 2,500 years ago, these ruins form one of the earliest kind of hospital. It wasn't the sort that you and I might recognize, perhaps. There were no anesthetics, no antibiotics, nor any doctors with highly specialized training. It was more a temple for healing, a place where pilgrims could simply come to rest in these peaceful and isolated surroundings. All of this may appear very strange by our standards, but the followers of Hippocrates appeared to understand one thing very well, that the human body, with a little help from the gods, had a great capacity for healing itself. In Los Angeles, this idea of leaving the body to heal itself has been taken to an extreme even Hippocrates could never have imagined. "11 a.m., July 6, 1999. A factory in downtown LA exploded. The man on this stretcher, Guillermo Vasquez, suffered horrendous injuries and was rushed to LA County Hospital. When he arrived in the emergency room, doctors had little hope that he would survive. Guillermo had a broken neck, a fractured skull, and a huge bleed into his abdomen. With so many terrible injuries, his surgeon, Dr. Dimitriades, had to make a very brave decision.
Because of the severity of the patient, we decided within a matter of minutes that we should follow a different approach, an unconventional approach, the so-called damage control procedure.
After multiple injury, the body is in an incredibly fragile state. Damage control recognizes that in this state it takes very little to kill the patient.
The human body has certain physiological reserves. If the physiological reserves become exhausted and he tips over the cliff, this is the end of patient's life.
So they did the bare minimum necessary to keep their patient alive. Ignoring his other injuries, they glued his liver together and packed it with gauze. And then, instead of sewing him back together, they covered his guts with plastic and left him in the hope that he would heal himself. As a surgeon, I instinctively want to fix people by doing something. I can't help feeling that I should be responsible for healing my patient. It's an incredibly difficult instinct to fight. But for any surgeon, there are times when the right thing to do is to do nothing. Guillermo was left to stabilize for 3 days in intensive care. Only then did Dr. Dimitriades attempt to perform further surgery. They removed the outer plastic cover.
There's some connection underneath there, and you're going to remove this as well.
To their relief, his liver was now healing and his internal bleeding had stopped.
The bowel looks nice and healthy. It's good news.
After checking his bowel for further injuries, they reconstructed his abdominal wall with a special membrane made out of pig's intestines. And then, at last, they sewed him up.
Okay. His chances of survival, you can ask any surgeon anywhere in the world, will tell you that are near zero. I am certain that without this damage control procedure, he would have died on the table in the operating room during the first operation. With more and more experience you get, you realize that the less you do, the better it will be for the patient, sometimes.
But after everything that has happened to Guillermo, it is the next few weeks in intensive care that could well kill him. This is the intensive care unit, where it takes around 100 nurses to look after just 13 people. That's because every patient is given life support. Machines breathe for them, feed them, and remove waste products. Every vital organ can be carefully monitored around the clock. What everyone is hoping for is any sign of recovery. But the staff know that they need to look out for something else.
20% of patients who die from injuries die in the intensive care unit approximately 2 to 3 weeks after their injury.
Just when you think they're getting better, organs like the liver and kidneys start to fail. They die because sometimes the body overreacts to trauma. It's called multiple organ failure. And it's what should have happened to Peter Bloud and Jennifer Vaughan, both of whom suffered horrific multiple injuries.
My car was hit on the driver's side door, which was then pushed into the fence on the other opposite side of the road. I was bleeding to death from the lower base of my spine. They had to remove my spleen because it had ruptured at the accident. My liver also had a tear in it, and my pelvic bone was broken in 6 places.
Peter Bloud also suffered massive injuries during a motorbike crash.
I was riding my street bike going around a corner, and as I looked up, I saw a vehicle sitting right in the middle of the road. I had a broken wrist, a couple spots, broken collarbone, both front and back, 10 broken ribs. A couple of those ribs actually punctured my lung. The bottom ribs severed my lung. I ruptured my spleen upon impact. I bruised my kidneys. I realized my left arm had almost fallen off, and it was hanging there by the skin.
His injuries were so extensive that his probability of surviving was probably less than 10%.
Multiple injuries like Jennifer's and Peter's are common in car accidents. Because in a car accident, several different collisions happen at the same time. Metal crashes into metal. Organs crash into skeletons or get ripped from their moorings. Flesh is pierced and punctured. The human body just hasn't evolved to cope with injuries as dreadful as these. In the wild, animals who are injured beyond the point of self-repair simply die. There are no medical systems to keep them alive. Death is part of the natural order of things. But we, of course, are different.
These patients basically are surviving injuries that evolution did not plan on them surviving.
Technology means we now keep people alive, even when their injuries are well beyond the normal limits of the body's ability to heal itself. Kept alive by machines, the body is understandably in a state of confusion, and it responds by overcompensating. Severe injuries trigger the release of huge numbers of white cells called neutrophils into the blood. Their job is to kill bacteria, but they can end up killing you. It's like cars in the rush hour. In response to injury, millions of neutrophils all trying to get to work at the same time. They're all heading in the same direction towards the injury site, where they're trying to kill any invading bacteria. But sheer weight of numbers can lead to disaster. The trouble is, when there's been really serious trauma, you get too many of them. And then they all stick together, which is what they're designed to do, and then a jam starts, and in the end, you get gridlock. A gridlock of neutrophils will eventually block normal blood flow. Without blood, the oxygen supply to vital organs is cut off. One by one, they shut down and die. And the very cells which should be saving life can actually end it. When Peter Bloud and Jennifer Vaughan arrived at hospital, Dr. Mayer anticipated both would have a long stay in the ICU and develop multiple organ failure.
Even though we were able to stabilize her initially, her risk of developing multiple organ failure and even having a high risk of dying from multiple organ failure was significant.
He was found at the scene.
To try to prevent this happening, Jennifer and Peter were rapidly given an experimental drug called Leucarest.
Picked up by the paramedics, and because of the proximity of the...
The main reason you get total organ failure is because the neutrophils adhere to each other. The new drug works by coating their surface and stops them being sticky. If you stop them clumping together, you stop them from clogging up the blood supply. If you can stop gridlock happening, then hopefully you can also avoid multiple organ failure. Whether or not it was thanks to the drug, both Peter and Jennifer made extraordinarily rapid recoveries.
Although we cannot prove definitely that the drug is what did it, it was a remarkable recovery, and we've seen this in other patients that have received the drug also.
Just 2 months after her accident, Jennifer was back at work.
It changed my outlook on life a lot. You know, it taught me a lot about life and about people and about friends, and just to enjoy it while you're here, because it's so quickly you can lose it.
The opportunity and chances we get sometimes are taken away from us really quickly. And so you need to take advantage of life and live it to your fullest.
Three months after his damage control surgery, Guillermo was out of intensive care and out of danger.
Good morning, Guillermo. How are you? Are you all right? Yeah, tell him that he will recover well. He'll be stronger than before.
Usted se va a poner mucho más fuerte que estaba antes.
Gracias. I also want him once a year in Christmas, during Christmas time, to send me a card and tell me how he's doing.
El doctor quiere que usted le mande en las fiestas de Navidad una tarjeta a él para que le...
The ancient Greeks were the first to really emphasize the importance of listening to the body. And in a funny sort of way, after centuries of making huge technological strides, we've managed to come full circle. Modern medicine is undergoing a revolution, but it's a revolution that harks back to the ideas of the people that built this temple. We're now learning that as well as exploiting our strengths, we can work with our body to overcome its weaknesses. And in next week's program, we'll look at obvious weaknesses, like missing parts, and examine the often ingenious attempts we've made to replace them. We'll enter the world of prosthetics, robotics, and transplants.
You have to discipline yourself for about 6 weeks to make sure you get the clear thinking processes in your head. Otherwise, it just goes bananas. It has a mind of its own.
And we'll hear what it's really like to have another person's limb attached to your own body.
I've had people in airplanes. I had one lady ask to be moved to another seat because she didn't like the fact of sitting next to me with this hand that belonged to a dead person.
Superhuman returns next Monday at 8:30. And Thursday night on Quantum, we continue to examine the face with a look at how we convey emotions and discover why we're able to conceal and manipulate our emotions through our face. Join us for The Face on Quantum, 8:30 Thursday night. Coming up, the comedy of Backburner.
Discipline yourself to make sure you get the clear thinking processes in your head. Otherwise, it just goes bananas.
Implants have been used to treat blindness and deafness.
Kyle, for the first time in his life, is about to hear ordinary sound.
But sometimes there's no substitute for the real thing.
Doctors have been transplanting hearts for years. So why not a hand?
Tonight, 8:30, Superhuman.
It's horrible, isn't it? The human face can do some truly amazing contortions. Thanks a lot. But without these contortions, let's be nice and call them expressions, We never know what's going on in the minds of these people. You never know what's going on inside my mind. Let's face it. This is one of the most amazing signalling devices known to nature. Well, tonight, we discover just what a face can say.
Face, it tells us about many different things: identity, beauty, attractiveness, emotion.
We can't imagine what it would be like to live in a world where we were so socially isolated, where the face didn't mean anything, where the emotional connection with people's faces just was not there.
I think when you look at the importance of the face to ourselves, you really need to look at people who have some problem with it.
The human face. We peer, we gaze, we primp. For our face is what we display in the great dance of life. The rhythm, the costume, the footwork are all flurries of flamenco energy. But, as in life, the subtleties are conveyed in the face. But, while we examine the expressions, chances are we're partners in a far more primal choreography. However, unconsciously, when we look at a face, we evaluate the genetic superiority of its owner. Our simple criterion, facial symmetry.
If you take pictures from one society and take pictures of individuals in a society and then get them rated by the individuals in that society for attractiveness, and then take those same pictures to another society, the ratings correlate very, very highly. So clearly human beings, wherever they are seeing attractiveness the same way. It's well known that bad genes contained within an individual due to mutation create asymmetry in the body. So a symmetric individual is an individual who has dealt successfully with any environmental insults, including diseases that throw off the development of perfect symmetry.
That makes men so attractive.
Okay, Jill, I'm going to do your left ear. We know also that people with symmetric faces have relatively symmetric bodies. We study both facial symmetry and we study symmetry of the body off the face. Left elbow is 63, right elbow is 61. We then look at the relationship between these measurements to sexual behavior in humans. So we study a sexual partner number, and we find that for men, more symmetric individuals report having had more partners.
Joel, I'm going to do your left ear width.
Also, we find that more symmetric men engage in more infidelity, mating outside their regular romantic relationship.
70.37.
And again, we think this is due to the symmetric men's greater attractiveness. The reason that we have this obsession with looks, and symmetry being an important part of that, is that throughout evolutionary history, individuals who preferred healthy others, and in this case symmetric others, would have obtained mates that survived better, were better providers, had good genes for the offspring that were produced from those mateships, and so forth.
But facial symmetry and its promise of genetic prowess isn't all we look for in a mate. For our faces flesh out a far broader heritage. Our static facial features say who we are. Our slowly changing features, the wrinkles, the texture, the colour, show how we've weathered life. And the rapid signals, thousands of muscle contractions, create the greatest signalling device in human experience, facial expression. Why did we develop so many facial expressions? We look to our closest relatives. Most of them had the muscles for the job, but gorillas are expressionless. Chimpanzees are full of expression. The difference? Social need.
Chimpanzees live in quite large social organizations that are very fluid. Small groups come together and then break up and then come together. So there's a great need to exchange information because animals are not together all the time. In contrast, gorillas live in very tight-knit social groups, specifically a harem society, one adult male, several females that really live together throughout their lives, except for mortality. So the entire social organization puts different kinds of pressures on the need to express facial expressions. So we take that kind of logic and we translate it to human populations. The big differences come less in terms of musculature, come more in the range of social interactions that we have and the accompanying emotions that go along with those interactions.
Facial interaction begins within hours of us arriving into the world.
That's very clever.
Mothers scrutinize their babies' facial expressions. Babies reciprocate.
Good.
Psychologists believe the process is hardwired.
Pediatricians used to tell mothers that smiling was just gas in the newborn and didn't represent anything having to do with the infant's pleasure or wasn't a real social signal. But now we know better. It's a kind of bonding between the mother and the infant, and it's something that lets mothers think the baby knows them and is responding to them. The basic repertoire of infant facial expressions is very similar across cultures and across racial and ethnic groups. You can see the same distinctive facial configurations in babies in all cultures.
Even babies with birth deformities like cleft palate attempt the full range of baby expressions. And their mothers are able to interpret the expressions despite the facial disability. Immediately after corrective surgery, these babies assume the normal range of expressions.
What's interesting here is that in this first session, after the surgery, he immediately started pursing his lips in the same kinds of contexts that babies without clefts did all along. And so that suggests that it's kind of built into the nervous system.
Most facial expressions are identical across vastly differing cultures. Whether we learned them or inherited them in our genes was a question posed by none other than Charles Darwin.
Darwin believed that our emotions have evolved, that they are innate, they are not socially learned, that they are universal. That was one of his big pushes, was to show, and he was really the first person to gather any evidence that expressions are universal. And he hoped to prove by that we all have a common ancestor.
Earlier in his career, Professor Ekman believed facial expressions were learned. But in the 1960s, Ekman visited a New Guinea tribe. The tribespeople were so isolated, their expressions couldn't possibly have been learned from elsewhere.
And you'll first see sort of smiles of enjoyment as they hear their music coming out of this box. They're very attentive. You don't need to know their culture in order to know that they're amused and enjoying this. When I started my cross-cultural work, it was to prove Darwin wrong once and for all. I believed, I was a cultural relativist. I was trained in the 50s, and I believed that everything important was socially learned. So it was a great shock to most scientists. Aren't so surprised by their findings. I was very surprised.
We possess an innate ability to interpret a staggering range of expressions. The facial signals our brains interpret instinctively have taken years of scientific endeavour to catalogue.
Let's see here. So should we look through it one?
Faces are movements. Expressions are movements. The muscles contract and pull skin in different directions.
We have the lip press.
It took about 7 or 8 years to develop what we called the facial action coding system. We charted 10,000 different expressions, each one different from the other, that you could recognize and distinguish in the course of developing facts.
Oh, and then her nostrils are dilating. So we have a 38.
And it is a technique that teaches the person who learns it and how to do a live dissection, how to look at an expression and specify which muscles produce the expression, because that's the only way you can describe it is in terms of the muscles.
Some of our 10,000 or so facial expressions are simply survival signals. In threatening situations, we display anger, fear, and disgust. The question is, are those expressions driven by our emotional state? Or are they contrived to evoke a response?
We can think about what facial expressions are doing at sort of two levels. There is the emotion that drives the expression, and then there's the consequences of that, which is that it allows sort of a vehicle for us to manipulate what others are doing.
If facial expressions are designed to manipulate, we must exert control over them. Professor Hauser suspects that is what occurs amongst primates.
In many primate species, when a subordinate is being approached by a dominant individual, they put on a facial expression called a fear grimace, which involves retracting the lips, almost kind of a smile. And what you'll often see is if a subordinate sees a dominant at a distance before the dominant has approached, they might initiate kind of a minor grin, just sort of barely retracting the lips, and as the dominant approaches, would pull on a full fear grimace face.
Facial deception is a common ploy amongst primates. It is no less so with humans.
What people may need to learn, if they want to recognize it, since most people don't, is the difference between an involuntary expression and a masking expression, or one that we call a false expression. It's put on specifically for the purpose of misleading you.
Professor Ekman has analysed telltale signs of facial deception.
How long have you held this opinion? Probably since I was about 17 when I started smoking.
Is this your true opinion?
Yes. You didn't just make this up a few minutes ago.
No.
Are you lying to me now?
No.
When people are lying, they often, during the blink, will hold the blink longer than normal, as if they don't want to see what's going on.
You didn't just make this up a few minutes ago.
No.
Did you bring that money with you into this room?
No, I did not.
And are you lying to me now?
No, I'm not.
When you ask him, are you lying, the fact that he has to look, pause and look up before giving his reply is still another sign of lying.
Charles Darwin laid the foundation for the contemporary study of emotion and analyzed a lot of different emotions like anger, fear, the smile, sadness, and so forth that really guided future research. And he really ignored embarrassment. When I started my research on embarrassment, I really wanted to know, first of all, what is the facial expression of embarrassment? There had been very little research on that in any systematic way.
Okay, please raise both eyebrows. Good, hold them high. Okay, good. Now, close one eye. Okay, good. Now, please pucker your lips. Good. Now, puff out both cheeks.
I've conducted a couple of different studies, and in one, the participant has to make a really funny-looking facial expression. They're given very serious instructions. They hold it for 15 seconds while they're being videotaped, and then they're told to relax, and it's there where the embarrassment kicks in.
Okay, you can rest now.
And what we saw is a really nice pattern of behavior. They avert their gaze down. They start to smile, but they move their mouth in a couple of ways by pressing their lips or sucking their lips in, which gives the embarrassed smile the self-conscious quality that a lot of people have talked about. Then they typically turn their head down and to the left, and about 25% of the time they touch their face.
His nickname is known as the Jack.
One of the most common causes of everyday embarrassment is teasing.
He ended up scoring on ourselves.
And what you'll see is the high-status individual on the right teasing the low-status individual, and the low-status fraternity members tended to show a lot of embarrassment, which we predicted. And what's really nice, and you'll see just a wonderful prototypical example of embarrassment coming up, touching the body, smiling nervously, looking down and to the left, is that the more that our target of teasing showed embarrassment, the more pleasure the teaser actually experienced. And then this kind of interaction actually increased the closeness between these individuals.
We lost. Thanks, Brian. The Jack.
Even though embarrassment is painful to our own experience, it has a really vital function, which is that it serves as an appeasement gesture, an apology for making a social mistake, and really a promise to honor that rule that you violated in the future.
Our faces send out an astonishing array of social signals. We signal our surprise. We divulge our delight. We convey our most heartfelt emotions. Without that ability, life is much more difficult.
I'm a clinical doctor, and I first got interested in the face when I saw someone who'd lost facial expression, who was wheeled into a clinical meeting, and the doctors thought, well, this woman's demented. And they thought that because they asked her questions and she couldn't reply with feeling on her face. I think when you look at the importance of the face to ourselves, you really need to look at people who have some problem with it, because we are intensely social beings. And as someone said, I exist in the facial expression of the other, meaning how I perceive my esteem to be, which in turn is how I feel about myself, depends to a great deal on the way you respond to me. So that if I make a joke and you smile, I smile too. You know, there's a figure of 8 going on between us. And then you think, well, what about someone who's got a facial disfigurement? And every time they go into a new situation, people are going, ugh. You know, he's abnormal, she's abnormal. What does that make the person who has that facial disfigurement feel about themselves? And the answer is that they obviously don't feel great about themselves.
It was at 18 months of age that doctors first noted something developmentally wasn't right. I wasn't smiling in the ways that other children were supposed to be smiling. I had some difficulty in holding my head up. And those are the first signs that my parents were experiencing that brought them to doctors to say what's going on. Up until then, I led a developmentally normal life.
Matthew Joffe suffers from the rare Mobius syndrome, dead face. The nerve controlling all of Matthew's facial muscle movements failed to develop. Matthew's inability to convey facial signals means many people just don't know how to interact with him.
I like and always have liked being with people. I think in part it may be a reaction to being lonely as a child, as someone with Mobius and not being socially accepted. But I've always wanted to be with people. My real friends, accept me as I am now. They know when I'm feeling blue. They know when I'm happy. They can hear it in my voice. They have taken the time to assimilate my set of characteristics and make sense of them. And I'm comfortable with that. I really tell people that if you listen carefully, you can hear me smiling. And I really believe that.
So, what should we do? Have you make some faces? All right, so just clear your mind. I want you to wrinkle your nose and let your lips part when you wrinkle your nose. That's it.
The emotional well-being of people like Matthew Joffe may well be enhanced by Professor Ekman's discovery about the relationship between our expressions and our feelings.
Any feelings, sensations? One of our strangest discoveries, and I think still one of our most controversial discoveries, is that not only is the face a system that shows emotions that are occurring, but that if you voluntarily make facial muscle movements, you can turn on the physiology of emotion. So the arrows go both ways.
Matthew Joffe traveled to San Francisco to meet Ekman. There, they wondered if trying to smile would have the same effect as actually smiling.
It puts me in a smile mode. I feel it. It's there, just as much as a real smile on the outside is for those that can do that. Perhaps this is as real as it's ever going to get for me, physiologically speaking. And I'm very grateful because I had not ever really thought about it. Not just could I do it, but what it could do for me inside.
To be without a face in a world obsessed by them is to be alone. Our faces signal our sexual superiority. Our expressions declare our desire to belong. But in our quest for acceptance, how long will it be before we enlist technology to refashion the face that nature provided?